Today's podcast is with someone that I've known for quite a while, going back to the Kurzweil K2000 list on the Just Getting Started internet. He's been a great supporter for the arts, a great supporter for a lot of communities, both on and off the internet, and he has been a fantastically successful businessman as well. I hope you enjoy this discussion with Chuck Surack of Sweetwater Sound. Okay, this week I have a real special treat. It's a special treat for me. I get to talk to somebody who I've interacted with over the years and who I've always respected. His name's Chuck Surack, and I'm sure that you know the name. He is the founder and the president of Sweetwater. Is it Sweetwater Music?
You know, technically it's Sweetwater Sound, but we just go by Sweetwater. So he's the head of Sweetwater. You've now heard his voice, and I am really pleased to present to you Chuck Surack. Chuck, hi, Darwin.
How are you?
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Good,
it's a real pleasure for me to talk to you. I feel like our paths have crossed a few times over the years, and I've always really respected what you've done for the community. And particularly in the past, when I was really involved in the Kurzweil world, you were a real leader in that area. So I want to just thank you for that, first of all.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been great to know you for so many years.
Yeah, indeed. Secondly, I have kind of a shtick that I do in my podcast, which is that I ask people about how they get to be the person they are. Now, a lot of times that means how do they get to be a certain kind of artist or whatever. But I think that your story is going to be kind of unique because in addition to now running what is probably the most well-known national, if not international, music store, you also have this really interesting background as a musician and a music tech. And so I would like to hear a little bit about your background and how you got to be in the position that you are.
Oh, my goodness. How far back do you want to go?
Well, as far back as makes sense. I'm just really curious about you.
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate that. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I did start really early as an entrepreneur. When I was 5 years old, I started my first business making pot holders where you put the little loops in a frame and go around the outside of the frame. And I would sell those pot holders in 1964 for 15 cents a piece or $2 for a quarter. And my goal was to get a mini bike. And I eventually got that mini bike and several other things. I sold lots of pot holders. And my next business after I'd sold to every person in my little town where I grew up in southern Ohio, my next business was delivering newspapers. And so I believe if you're going to do something, do it as well as you can do it. I've always preached that. I believe that's so important. And where most of my friends had 40 or 50 newspapers to deliver, I delivered to apartment complexes. And so I delivered 330 newspapers.
Wow.
And that's kind of my personality of doing it to extreme. Scouting was really important to me, and I know scouting's a little bit out of favor today, but in Cub Scouts I had so many arrow points, they went off my shirt and into my pants. And probably what set me up for life is Boy Scouts. Again, not maybe as favorable today as it was when I was a kid, but Boy Scouts learn a lot of things, but they learn an oath, and that oath says that a Boy Scout will be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Those are amazing principles to live by personally, and frankly, they're amazing principles to live by in your business and live by professionally. And so, being trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, it just built into my DNA, and it's the way that I treat my friends, my family members, and the way I want to treat our customers and run our business. And it's just a philosophy that's worked really, really well for me. Anyway, continuing on my growing up, I wanted to play trombone, and my dad said, oh, my gosh. You have to understand, my dad was a frustrated accordion player, and he said, you don't want to play trombone. They never get solos. And so my dad wanted me to play saxophone. And so I guess he was living vicariously through me or something, but he got me a saxophone. I brought it home. I was so proud. I'm going to learn. I'm in 5th grade. I'm going to learn to play the saxophone. And I go to the local music teacher at the school, and I said, look at this. And, I honked some awful-sounding duck squeal out of it. And he says, that's great, except you have the mouthpiece on upside down. So I flipped the mouthpiece over, and my saxophone playing took off from there. And other than lessons in band, I never had a private lesson on a saxophone. I started to take lessons after playing for a couple of years, and I went to the first introduction, and the music teacher said, play this, play that. I played all those things, and he said, go out and buy these books and come back next week, and I'll give you your first saxophone lesson. Between my introduction and my first saxophone lesson, he broke both his legs water skiing, and I ended up not having lessons with him, and I never took a lesson again on a saxophone. And if you fast forward, I played professionally all over the country. I got to play on stage with some pretty famous people and played well enough just by listening to others and by reading books and being self-taught. And that's what I've done, frankly, with everything in my life. There's only two things I've taken lessons on, and I can talk about those later. But everything else, from teaching myself electronics, teaching myself computer programming, has all been done out of books and now, of course, the internet, and teaching myself. Unlike probably most of the listeners, I didn't go to college. I think, I would always recommend that you do, but in my case, I went on the road immediately after high school, and I started playing saxophone and keyboards all over the country. And when I play in these top 40 bands at the local Holiday Inn or the various nightclubs or schools and that sort of thing, not only was I playing saxophone and keyboards, but I was also running the mixer from the side of the stage. And back in those early days, if you wanted to do a recording of your band, you went into a radio station. There weren't very many recording studios around.
Right.
And so I would go into the local radio station wherever we were playing, and I was always the guy that was technical enough that knew how to run the equipment. And so I'd be the recording engineer for the band. And after doing that for several years and frankly not making any money on the road, I came home and started my recording studio with a VW bus. It was the same VW bus that I had used on the road, and I'd inherited it from my parents. My mom had wrecked it, and I filled the front end of the VW up with 2 gallons of Bondo, and I painted the VW bus with 99-cent cans of spray paint from Kmart. And that was my vehicle. And I moved back to Fort Wayne, Indiana after being on the road, and I would take my VW bus, and I had acquired a TIAC 3340 4-track recorder on the road, and I would pull up to the local school or the church or the business. I'd run 100 or 200 feet of microphone cables into the building, and I would mic up the choir or the band or the speaker, whatever it was, and record them while sitting in my bus with headphones on.
Oh, I see.
Crazy business. And then I would take those recordings from my VW bus, and I would go out to my little 12 by 60 mobile home where I lived, and I would carry the recorder into the living room, and I would edit this is back when it was reel-to-reel tape, but I would edit the tape together to take out the extraneous noises and pauses and that sort of thing. I'd also put a little artificial reverb on it. Sometimes I'd put fake applause, whatever I could do to make the performance sound better and give the customer more value, frankly, than they even paid for. And
right.
Again, that's one of the principles that we still foster today. Down in New Orleans, they have a phrase called lagniappe, which means giving a little extra. And so at Sweetwater, we like to give a little extra. But I soon moved from the VW bus and the mobile home to my first commercial building. I had a 1,000-square-foot house, and I built a little recording studio off the end of the house. So now, not only would I take my bus out on location, but I could have people come to my studio and record. And what really changed the course of my company and the business was 1984. I had a friend who was a music dealer, and he took me to the NAMM show up in Chicago. NAMM is the National Association of Music Merchants. It's a show that all the dealers go to. And I got to stand in line for about 2 hours to see a prototype of the Kurzweil K250 synthesizer. And it was the first keyboard that actually played back digital recordings of other instruments. And it's a long story, but it was designed by Ray Kurzweil on kind of a challenge from Stevie Wonder. And when I saw this machine, and when I first saw it, it was a prototype and basically a bunch of computers. And I said, this is so cool. When they turn it into a real product, I have to have this in my recording studio. And so I bought one of the very early ones. And my theory was that I could replace the little Yamaha grand piano I had in my studio with the Kurzweil K250 and have not only the piano sound, because it had a digital recording of a 9-foot piano, but it had 38 other sounds in it also, from an upright bass to a string section, a choir, and all those sorts of things. And at the end of every one of my recording sessions, I could tell my clients, would you like to hear your music with an upright bass? Would you like to hear your music with a choir, with a string section? Again, I was offering them a little extra, a little lagniappe. And it allowed me to have additional booking time. I also went all around the Midwest, and my keyboard and my playing were used on other people's albums and recording studios and that sort of thing. And being the technical guy that I was, now I own this Kurzweil K250. I had serial number 32. One of the options that soon came out for it was that you could sample your own sounds. And being a recording guy, that was pretty compelling to me. So I did. I started recording my own sounds, and then eventually I reverse engineered how the machine worked and designed my own sounds that would go. I wrote computer programs that would then burn them onto EEPROMs. And once they were on the EEPROMs, you could insert the sound permanently into your Kurzweil K250.
Right.
And to make a really long story short, I started communicating with other Kurzweil owners, which happened to be famous musicians: Stevie Wonder, Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, Lyle Mays, Bob James, all these older famous artists, and a lot of studios and schools. And you could call them up, and it was almost like a brotherhood. Wow, you have a K250, I have one too. And so I started trading sounds with people, and next thing you know, I realized that I'm so busy copying the little 3.5-inch Macintosh floppy disks that it's just overwhelming me. I don't even have time to do the recording studio stuff anymore. So I hired my first employee, and he started working in the studio, and I just copied discs for all my friends.
Okay.
My friends just happened to be famous friends.
Right.
And next thing you know, my famous friends are calling me to come out and work on their machines and put new software in it and help them learn it. And so I was flown all around the country to help famous people and not so famous people. Next thing I know, my friends are going, "Hey, I understand you can do music on the computer." And I'd always been a technical guy. I taught myself, computer stuff. I taught myself the electronic kind of things. And I said, "Yeah, I know how to do that." And I started helping my friends with music software. Then they wanted to know about recording, so I became a dealer and started selling recording equipment from Tascam. And it just kind of fast forwarded to where we are today. And today we have nearly 1,000 employees. We'll do almost $500 million in business. We are the number one online retailer of selling music equipment to customers all over the country.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And one that has, I'm curious about a bunch of stuff in there. And so I'm just going to kind of fling some questions at you, and we'll see where it goes. First of all, I'm amazed that, it's amazing to think that Sweetwater Sound has evolved from the acquisition of a 3340.
That's amazing.
That's a pretty wild story. Tell me a little bit about the creation of the studio, and even maybe more elemental, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Why Fort Wayne?
Well, I was actually born in Southern Ohio, but when I was going into 7th grade, my parents moved to Fort Wayne, where my mom was from. And so it was just to be close to grandparents and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And Fort Wayne is my home. I went to high school here. I consider it home. It ends up being a phenomenal place to grow a business. The state of Indiana has really done a great job of attracting lots of other businesses. We've got a quality of life in this state that's just simply phenomenal. And the cost of living is extraordinarily low. People that live on the coast, they'll tell me what they're putting down for a down payment on a home, and I tell them they can buy a whole house in Indiana for the price of their down payment.
Right.
And also, Indiana is centrally located, so for what we're doing today, a huge percentage of our customers are located within 1 day of shipping.
Sure.
From Indiana. Fort Wayne specifically, more than half of our employees, we've relocated to Fort Wayne. And Fort Wayne's got all kinds of minor league sports things going on. We're doing our downtown is really starting to grow and take off. And then we're only 3 hours from Chicago, 2 hours from Indianapolis, 3 hours from Detroit. So it's just a great community to live in.
What years was it that you were kind of bringing the studio up to speed? Right.
So I started in the VW bus in 1979. I graduated from high school in 75, so I was on the road for about 4 years. But in 79, I started the studio in the VW bus, and in 1981 is when I built my first studio. It was about the size of a 2-car garage. And by then I had graduated from the 3340 to an 8-track 80-8, and then eventually a 16 and 24 track. But it was the early 80s.
Okay. Yeah, so now my recollection, because I actually was putting together a studio down in Texas at roughly the same time, and also with very similar gear and stuff. And there was a lot of change in the air at the time. I mean, first of all, it was a time where digital processing and even digital recording was just starting to come online a little bit. But also, you could buy really great mics for cheap because a lot of people didn't value some of the older gear. All of the new gear was really exciting, and so you could get stuff sometimes quite cheaply. But also you saw things like reverb systems and stuff starting to improve in quality a little bit. How closely were you tracking that stuff at the time?
Oh, very closely. I'm a gear nut, always been a gear nut, and you're absolutely right on the money. A couple things. I can tell you that I used to go to trade shows, whether it was the AES show or eventually even the NAMM shows, and I could at that point go into pawn shops and find U87 microphones or Sennheiser 421, 441s for $50 or $100. You know,
Right.
those are thousands of dollars today, and I could buy them at a pawn shop and bring them back and either put them in my studio and use them, or quite often I'd bring them back and I'd sell them elsewhere.
Oh, sure.
And that would finance my trip to the trade show.
Right. Oh, that's great.
I remember when there was a company called Ursa Major brought out the first pretty affordable digital reverb. It was called a Stargate 323.
Right.
And Phil Collins had this big, huge drum sound at the time where he hit a tom or a snare and it would just ring and then cut off. And that was done clearly with that sort of a device. But, you know, I couldn't afford the big expensive ones. But the Stargate from Ursa Major 323 was $2,500, and that was the first digital reverb where I could dial in the exact decay time and all that. And I remember the very first one being shipped in the Midwest to Full Compass Systems up in Madison, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a good customer of theirs, and I worked it out that they would sell me the very first one, and I immediately drove my vehicle up to Wisconsin and paid full price for it just to get it. You know?
Yeah, well, that was an amazing time. I actually remember there was some major stuff and how drool-worthy that was.
Drool-worthy. I love that word. I like that. I'm going to use that.
But one of the things that I remember from that time that was kind of frustrating was the nature of like the music magazines at the time. So when, you know, now we're kind of lucky because there are things like Tape Op and Electronic Musician and stuff that kind of have this, or at least promote the DIY or like bake it yourself mentality. At the time, it was like DB and Mix Magazine. And I remember every one of them would come and it would have like, you know, the power station, and it would show this amazing room with the amazing piano and the amazing console. And it was kind of a little frustrating for me with a little recording studio in the middle of nowhere to kind of look at that and say, well, that's never going to be me. And I wonder how you felt at the time about that kind of thing.
I remember those magazines, and I didn't disagree with you. And fast forward to today, I do have a beautiful world-class studio with a big Yamaha C7 piano and gorgeous rooms. I could have never envisioned in the early 80s having a room like you know, I've been on the cover of Mix Magazine, so I get it now.
Right.
But I will also tell you, I do remember very clearly in the late 70s, early 80s, I told you I taught myself electronics. But man, I had to fix mixing consoles because there was no one around here who could fix them. And I had to know how to align a tape machine and set the bias on it. And all those sorts of things allowed me to learn electronics, but I also built a lot of my own equipment. And I remember getting Craig Anderton's book, you know, the Projects for Musicians early on. One of the magazines that's been gone for a long time that I loved was Recording Engineer and Producer.
Yes.
And in that magazine, they had a lot of things where you could build stuff. And so I built my own reverbs, my own compressors. I used to build microphones, as crazy as that sounds. There was a hi-fi store here in town that was a Shure dealer, and I would go out and buy replacement SM58 and 57 elements from him, and they were about $25.
Mm-hmm.
And I would buy the element, and then I would solder directly to the bottom of the element a tip ring sleeve wire, or you know, an XLR connector, and not have a transformer in it or anything. And then what I did, because it had no body, it was just the top of the microphone.
Right.
I would go to the local hardware store, and for about 75 cents, I could buy rubber feet off of it that they would sell as replacements for a table or chair or something.
Right.
I could force the microphone into those rubber feet, cut the bottom out, and I would make a microphone that had about a 1-foot umbilical cord coming out the end with the XLR connector, and it had these rubber feet that would allow the mic to fit in the microphone clip. And so for about $26, $27, I could make an SM58 mic when they were probably selling for, I don't know, $80 or $100 even back then.
Yeah, well,
So I made lots and lots of equipment, and that's how I got by, because I couldn't afford to buy it either.
Sure. That's actually interesting, because that does kind of point to the fact that even though it wasn't celebrated, sort of like for recording people, kind of that hacker mentality existed at the time, because there was no other options. I too remember Anderton's book coming out, and the number of times that I wasn't great at electronics at the time, but I would still sort of like, it was like some combination of solder and glue would end up making a piece of gear that would sometimes save the day. And there was not even a way to buy something at that point that would help out.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit more about your entree into the Kurzweil, because this is where you must have it must have been a huge leap of faith for you. Because at the time, if I recall right, the Kurzweil K250 would have cost more than a car.
Yes, it did. And the other interesting thing was they came out with more options. It was a works in a drawer. You could pull 3 screws out and pull the whole drawer out. You could put more options in that were another price of a car.
Right.
It was amazing how expensive that instrument was. But at the end of your fingertips, you had real recordings of other real instruments. And that was just so powerful. So and that's why it was a very, very famous instrument. And it was used, and there are still some people that are using it professionally, but it was used on TV until just a few months ago when David Letterman, finally retired from the TV show. Paul Schaefer quit using his on stage. But,
really?
For an instrument made in 1984, 85 and still being played, that's pretty amazing to me.
Now, was like the Synclavier and the emulator out yet at that point?
Yeah, both were. And I owned both of those. I owned a Synclavier for 30 days. That was a disaster. After buying the Kurzweil, my studio was really doing well, and I became fascinated with the Synclavier because they had the hard disk recording.
Right.
So you could, and I was doing lots of jingles at the time, and the idea of being able to sing at one time and then just fly it around was just so fascinating to me. But I bought the Synclavier and thinking it would do everything the Kurzweil did and then some, and I was quickly discovered that it wasn't. There were some great things it did, but there were also a lot of things that weren't ready for prime time. And to make a long story short, I enacted a lemon law, and I got them to take the instrument back after 30 days because it was a nightmare.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people. I think a lot of people assumed that the Synclavier was a wonder and everybody fell in love with it and did all their music with it. But my experience is kind of similar. When I was running this recording studio in Texas, there was a local guy who got really super fascinated with it, and he would bring the Synclavier over to the studio, and I would swear for a 1-minute playback, it would take 8 hours to set the thing up. And then still, it was like constantly futzing around with it, trying to make it work properly. I remember looking at that, and that was one of those times where, unfortunately for me, it was one of those times where I was like, well, I ain't never touching that crap.
Yeah. It was a phenomenal instrument. It taught me a couple things. The couple things that it taught me, the keyboard on it was a phenomenal keyboard, and it had a whole bunch of switches, so it was very tactile. And to this day, I'm a guy that likes lots of tactile switches, and if I'm going to have some sort of mixing console interface, give me the knobs, give me the switches, and that's one thing the Synclavier taught me. The other thing the Synclavier did, this was back in the Mac II era. Mm-hmm. It was the first time I'd ever seen a computer with a big 19-inch 2-page display.
Right.
And from that day forward, I've never owned a computer on my desk that didn't have a display at least that big.
Right.
On the other hand, it had a $40,000, and I'm not exaggerating, $40,000 optical drive. And that was part of my frustration, that all my samples got erased off that drive one time due to a disk failure. After spending 3 weeks putting all these samples together, they just disappeared. And so they about put my studio out of business because I had borrowed a lot of money to buy it, but I was able to get the deal rescinded with a good lawyer.
Well, good for you on that. But it's interesting. So you actually got hands-on comparison of all the available systems at the time, and the Kurzweil was what you hung your hat on.
It is. I just love that they were real sounds that were permanently in memory. You turn it on, and they were instantly there. You could load additional ones into RAM, but having those sounds just right there, no other instrument did that at the time.
Right. That's an interesting point, and one that I think a lot of people now wouldn't really understand as a problem. which was, so a lot of my experiences was with the emulator, and sort of the frustration of starting a session by like digging through your floppy disks and putting it in and rattle, rattle, clack, clack, and you hope that it loaded up correctly. I can see where the K250 would have been a real warm and fuzzy, because you could turn it on and immediately play. And so if you have that kind of creative juice flowing thing, that would be really important.
Absolutely.
Also, as I recall, their piano sound was to die for in comparison to any other sampler at the time.
Well, I think a lot of the other hardware companies, and the ones you've mentioned, they put the tools and the power of the musicians and said, here, sample whatever you want to sample. And some people did a pretty good job. And of course, there were a lot of fun sounds, dog barks and fire trucks and all that sort of thing. Kurzweil went the other way. They said, we're going to send it to you as a complete instrument. And we've already spent lots of time in our recording studio, and they had this computer called a Mass Comp, and they'd written custom programs for it. And so they really, really processed those sounds so they sounded as good as they could make them sound. The reverse of that was their instrument was a little bit more difficult to sample your own stuff or to get around on. And so it tended to be players that played a Kurzweil K250 and not necessarily sound designers. Right. There were more sound designers using emulator and synclavier, and more musicians or players playing the Kurzweil.
So that really kind of opened up the door for you then when you kind of got into hacking your own sounds. That really opened the door for you to be kind of a big dog in sound design, right?
Absolutely. There were already lots of people doing libraries for the emulator products and for the others. Nobody was doing sounds for Kurzweil, so when I did it, it was kind of the only choice. They either got them from me or they got them from Kurzweil themselves, from the factory. And so in some ways, the door was opened a little bit and made it a little bit easier for me.
Kind of talking about the leap of faith, what was it about the Kurzweil that made you say, nobody else is doing this, but I have a gut feeling it's the right move for me? Was it because of the famous people using it, or?
No. It started before that. It was as simple as I had a Yamaha, and I'm not picking on Yamaha. I own several Yamaha pianos today, and I'm a Yamaha piano dealer, and they make fabulous instruments. Right. But any piano, all pianos, are always in a state of going out of tune. They just are. That's what they do. And in my little recording studio, every time I did a session, I'd have to have a tuner come in and tune the piano. And I have a pretty critical, I'm not a great musician, but I'm a good enough musician. But what I do have is a very critical ear. And I can hit the same chord 3, 4, 5 times in a row, and I start to hear the pitches change on a piano. Right. And so from the beginning of a recording session to the end, I'd go crazy about the sound of the piano changing. I do that at concerts to this day. I'll hear a piano at a concert, and it may be in tune at the beginning, and 4 songs in, it's like, oh, that chord's out of tune now. Right. And so that drove me nuts on the piano, and I thought for about the same value of my Yamaha piano, I could buy this Kurzweil and have 39 other sounds. And so it was a pretty easy, logical decision for me in my studio. Then the next step of how did I turn that into a business, I didn't initially think of it as a business. I just wanted to make more sounds for my own Kurzweil to use in my own studio. And I initially started with what I called the Sweetwater Sampling Network, where I was hoping to reach out to other users that had made sounds. So I was hoping to trade sounds with people, take some of the ones I done and trade with ones. And I did a little bit of that. But I quickly learned that, as I said, most of the people that had a Kurzweil weren't into it from a technical point of view.
They were players.
They just played it.
Right.
They were players. And so my friends would say, I don't have any sounds, but can I use yours? Well, okay, fine. And they kept asking that over and over. And finally I said, enough's enough. And I started charging for my sounds, $5 a disc. In the early days with the Macintosh, I had a little Mac. Well, actually, initially it was a 128 Mac, but then I had a 512 Mac. They hadn't even come out with an extra drive for it yet. So to copy a floppy disk, and they weren't really floppy, but they were a 3.5-inch little hard, rigid disk, it would take 52 swaps of in and out with the master disk, the system disk to the copy disk, system disk to the copy disk. So getting $5 out of somebody, and I would do that with my right hand as I'm running the session with my left hand or something. Right. But that's how that whole thing started. But it was really just to satisfy my own needs. As I said a little bit with the Boy Scout thing growing up, I've never done anything, I didn't say this real well, but I've never done anything for the money. Right. I always do things because it's the right thing to do, because I want to do it, because I believe in it. And I have been fortunate the money has come. But everything about our company is driven for doing the right thing for the customer. And that's what it was for me with the Kurzweil K250.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk about how you how you went from being a guy doing 52 floppy swaps to running what at the time even seemed to really quickly become a pretty large scale, and at the time I think mail order company. What did you do? Did you just like say, hey, I'm working with all this gear and I know it super well and I'm just going to start selling it?
It started by helping my friends, these famous friends, when they started using my sounds. As I said, they would call and go, hey, I understand you can do music on the computer. And I go, well, I know how to do that. And so I became a dealer for Mark of the Unicorn software, which way back then was Composer. Right. And then then there was Performer. And then eventually it became, Digital Performer and all that sort of stuff. But I would help my friends out with their Macintoshes and sell them Composer and a MIDI interface to go with it.
Okay.
And they just kept calling, asking for more and for more. And the coolest thing, where I really got lucky is that I started with high-end customers. And high-end customers, just really appreciated the help that I provided them. And like me, I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana. There was nowhere around here I could go to learn about MIDI or even recording. So I had to discover it on my own or ask others around the country. And that's what these professionals were doing. And they were using me to answer questions for them, to help them. Sometimes they'd fly me to their location, whether it was a studio or their home or hotel rooms. And quite often I could really help them on the phone. And I got to where I knew this Kurzweil K250 like the back of my hand. And I can't tell you how many calls I'd get in the middle of the night. Somebody tell me they're trying to do something, I would walk them through on how to do it because I could just do it from my head.
From memory, right. And
it exploded from there. I say it went from the software then to recording equipment. So I became a Tascam dealer. And then some people wanted Fostex, so I became a Fostex dealer. Early on, I became an EMU dealer, and it's funny, it was about when the Proteus came out. Oh, yeah. I became an EMU dealer, not because I wanted to do the Proteuses, but I wanted to do the Emacs. The Emacs to me, again, it was less than $3,000, was an amazing instrument. It only played 8 notes at a time, but it was very easy to sample on. And I took my greatest hits out of the Kurzweil K250, and I transferred them all into the Emacs. And my deal was that if you were a Kurzweil customer of mine and you also bought an Emacs, I would give you the samples that you could play on either format. Oh, and the advantage of that would be that you could have additional polyphony out of your Kurzweil. So you could buy a new Kurzweil for the price of a car and get 12 more notes of polyphony, or you could buy a sub $3,000 Emacs and get the same sound samples and frankly pretty similar quality and get 8 more notes of polyphony.
Right.
And so it's a great way to play more notes at one time or turn your Emacs into drum sounds or whatever you want to do. And so I took on EMU products and did really well with the higher end stuff. And for a long time, I specialized in higher end gear and didn't do so well with lower end gear because I was dealing with more premium clients and the kind of stuff that I wanted to use, so on and so forth. And
right.
The business just took off from there.
That's an interesting story. So that also answers another question I've always had, which is how did you become sort of a national force? I mean, I would say that you're, other than like maybe Guitar Center, which had to put up buildings in every town where they wanted to get some impact, you've had an impact in every locale in the U.S. just by, I'm not sure why, but I can see now why it is that you are national, because you started off with a national customer base with these high-end customers.
That is correct. And we practice the exact same principles today at our company. I've got nearly 300 sales engineers, about 2 million customers around the country. But we practice the same principles today that I did back in the beginning. Treat everybody the way you want to be treated. It's so simple. It's back to that Boy Scout thing again. And we have discovered ways and developed ways to support the customer on the phone.
Right.
And I've got 30 people that work in my technical support department that teach customers on the phone how to make their Tascam interface work with their Mark of the Unicorn software on an Apple computer.
Sure.
And you can't get that anywhere else. You can imagine calling Apple or Microsoft and asking about music software.
Yeah, and they'll just shrug. Right.
Yeah, they have no idea. You can't go into a Guitar Center, and I'm not picking on them. I think they do a lot of things really, really well. But you can't go in and find that level of expertise at most traditional stores. There's a few stores around the country that have some really bright people that have been into it a long time, but it's one of our strengths is really providing that support. And so our whole philosophy has not been necessarily about price, but just taking care of the customer, making sure they're really happy, making sure the system really works, and being here if it doesn't. And based on referrals and based on repeat business, the company has just grown like crazy.
Right. So you start off the company being able to pick up the phone and do things by memory because you're a self-professed gear nut, because you were obsessive about reading and understanding all the gear that you worked with, and by being accessible to people. How do you translate that into a situation where you have 300 salespeople and 30 tech service people? How do you get them to have that same kind of dedication to that?
Awesome question. Great question. Darwin, what we do is, first off, when we're trying to hire new people, and we're always looking for new people, we interview really hard and we test really hard. We find people that are just good people, and there are a lot of them across the country. Most of the folks that come to work for us, no matter what department they work in, they probably have a 4-year music technology degree. Today, there are a lot of schools, whether it's Full Sail or Miami University or Middle Tennessee or a conservatory in Mexico. There's great schools across the country teaching music technology sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And they weren't around when I started, but we'll hire someone with usually a 4-year degree out of one of those schools, or maybe they've got years of being on the road or in their own studio. We bring them to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then they spend 13 weeks of going through what we call Sweetwater University. And before they ever talk to a customer, they have to learn our philosophies. They have to further learn the rest of the technical stuff that we think they need to know, and they have to learn to work our systems. And I personally spend time with them. I've got 80 different teachers. Some are employees here, some are manufacturers reps, but we have about 80 different teachers that teach 300 different classes. And it's almost like getting your doctorate, but it's an investment of 13 weeks in every employee before they ever talk to a customer.
That's really interesting. That makes it more sense too. Yeah.
And our philosophy is you're either adding credibility to our company or you're taking credibility away from our company. And we've all worked so hard to get our brand and get people to trust us. I can't put a rogue new employee on the phone and have him make some bonehead answer to a question, because as soon as he doesn't tell an accurate thing to the customer says, oh, well, he's a liar. That means everyone at Sweetwater's a liar.
Right.
That. So we just train and train and train, and it's a huge investment that we make, but I think it's the right thing to do. And again, I'm not driven by the money. I'm driven by doing the right thing. And if I do the right thing, I've been fortunate enough the money does come.
That's cool. Now, you mentioned the money, and you never really play that up as a big thing, and you're also very quietly a supporter of a lot of different art groups and different technical groups. I saw it early in the days where you were super supportive of the Kurzweil groups, because it seemed like because you were into it, but also because you really wanted things to grow, and you were willing to sort of back it up with, gear and sometimes money and sometimes time. What are some of the things? Do you feel free to talk about some of the other things that you support in the arts?
Sure. Well, there's several thoughts here. First off, I think I have a responsibility, as I've been successful, to give back and to help others. I know you can't take it with you. I haven't seen too many U-Haul trailers at the cemeteries lately. and I just believe that I've been blessed so much that I'd be crazy not to want to give it back. I also believe the more I give, the more I receive. And, whether you're religious or not, it's just so true. Helping others feels good. It's the right thing to do. We support over 500 nonprofit organizations every year. Millions and millions of dollars, literally. And I'm just fortunate to be in a position to do that. I think the arts have done incredibly well for me personally. They've done well for my family. I know learning to play a music instrument, there's so many advantages, how it makes you better in life and helps you, with other education. And, just the skills you get as a musician are phenomenal. Being able to listen to yourself and critique yourself and get better, that Japanese word of kaizen, or constant improvement. And being able to listen to others and play in an ensemble and all those other skills that just help you, whether you play the music professionally or not going forward. They're just great skills to live by. And it's been a real shame across our country, as a lot of the school systems have either lessened or cut out their music programs. And I've just been a big advocate of playing a music instrument is just as important as learning science and technology and math and all those sorts of things. And so we put our money where our mouth is and support as much as we can. And, I serve on lots of various organizations and things that help people understand the value of music.
That's fantastic. And boy, we could use as many of you as possible. I feel like there's I feel like you that there's so many cases where they're attempting to cut art and music out of the school system. I think a lot of what has made things fantastic in our country has been the early support. Certainly when I was growing up, the support for the arts and for music in school. I was fantastically lucky to get the music education I did when I was growing up, and I would wish that for every kid today.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm involved with the local Boys and Girls Club. I'm involved with a bunch of different organizations, and it is so amazing to see the difference when a 5th or 6th grader gets an instrument, something that he can take joy and pride in, and he can get better or she can get better. And you just know they're set up a little bit differently than their peers, and I've seen many successes of that.
Well, that's so encouraging and exciting. I think we all would want to thank you for that. So one last question before you go, and it's just, this is just another one of those kind of curious things. You, because of your position and because of where you're at, you have the opportunity to use any instrument in existence, pretty much. When you sit down to have fun with playing, or fun with recording, or fun with whatever, what do you sit down and play?
Wow, great question. Because I'm such a technology nut, my interests change regularly. I just put a brand new piano in my home, a Yamaha piano, in fact, that has the new disc clavier technology in it. That's pretty fascinating to me that performers from around the world can be showing up on a video screen and pop on my piano and actually playing my piano. So that's interesting. But I would tell you what I really love playing is my saxophone. I still play almost every weekend in a little band, and I'm pretty at one with the horn. I can make it do whatever I want. I'm a much better sax player than I am a piano player. And so for all this technology that I sell and that I'm around, the saxophone's actually, pretty old. It was originally built in 1846, and it's about as low-tech as you can get. But it's what I love playing.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Chuck, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your really busy schedule to talk with me. It was fantastic hearing your story, and I wish the best of luck to you.
Darwin, thank you so much, and I hope the listeners enjoy listening to it also. Thank you.
All right. See you later. Bye. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Chuck. Thought it was really interesting to hear about his background and how he kind of got started in the business. This week I want to take a moment to thank a few of the people that have recently supported me through the Kickstarter campaign. This campaign was to put together the funds necessary to get a Zoom H2N recorder so that when I do face-to-face interviews, it goes better, and also so that I will have a backup system for when I inevitably forget to punch the record button on the computer. Two people that I want to acknowledge. First, Ben Carey, and secondly, Richard Garrett. I want to thank them for their generous contributions to the Kickstarter campaign and thank them for the support of the podcast and for me as well. With that, I want to sign off. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.